it's Mo. I want to talk about some authors that I am not going to read from again. So this was going around a little while ago on BookTube where people were saying some number of authors that they were not going to read from again. I know Criminali did this one and a few other people. I want to preface this with, never say never. It's always possible that I will read one of these authors again if they have a book that super intrigues me. But as of now, as of today, I don't think I want to read anything more by these authors. So I'm going to start with one that probably comes as no surprise and ends up on these lists a lot for me, which is George R.R. Martin. I read the first Game of Thrones books, A Song of Ice and Fire, whatever it's called, right when the TV show first came out, and I hated it. I liked certain characters' perspectives more than others, but overall I hated that there were so many characters. I hated that it was all multiple POV, and the story itself did nothing to really grab me, especially because the TV show was already out and I was able to watch that instead of read the books. Don't get me wrong, I'm not a Game of Thrones show fan either, so I definitely don't need to read any more of the Game of Thrones books, and I don't see any other books that George R.R. Martin has written or that he might write in the future that I would be interested in, so I will not be reading any more George R.R. Martin. I think right when I first moved to Asbury Park, I read The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo by Stieg Larsson, and I will not be reading any more of Stieg Larsson's books. I know he only has a few. The author has already passed away, but I really disliked the majority and certainly the message of The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. The parts that I liked more were following the main character searching for the mystery in the family and kind of in the remote town, but the whole Girl with the Dragon Tattoo part I hated. I hated what that book said about women and how misogynistic it was. I hated the characterization of the two main characters for the most part. There were certain aspects of each of their characters that were okay, but for the most part, I did not want to read any more from those two characters. So I will not be reading any more in that series, and I will not read anything else that Stieg Larsson put out or is posthumously published by him. Next is an author that I've read 2 books from. I read one under her real name, Rachel Hawkins. I read The Wife Upstairs, and that is a retelling, reimagining of Jane Eyre made into kind of a domestic thriller. I really disliked this book. It was one of my worst books of the year that I read it. I don't have a Jane Austen reference, so that could definitely be part of it, but the majority of it was that I didn't like the authorial voice. I didn't like how much cursing and how modern it was, which felt very dated and dating, like it was going to date the book in the future. I also thought that the mystery was pretty weak, as well as the execution of the crimes and the plot. I thought the main character was unlikable, not in a good way, and I didn't appreciate that she was a unreliable narrator because she had a disorder. I've also read Rachel Hawkins' pen name, Erin Sterling. I read The Ex-Hex, and I also really disliked this romance. Same thing, the authorial voice, the way that she writes her characters just is not appealing to me. The language that she uses and the vibe of the characters is just not for me. I didn't think this was a wholly terrible romance, but I did really dislike it. So I will not be reading any more Rachel Hawkins or Erin Sterling. The next author is one that I've very recently decided that I will not be reading any more of, and that is Ruth Ware. I read The Woman in Cabin 10, and again, I really disliked the idea that a woman who has a mental disorder is unreliable solely and only because of that mental disorder, even though she's handling it very well and she's coping with it and she has her whole life basically together. I also just didn't like the way that that book was written. I didn't think that it was particularly captivating or interesting. I don't remember a lot of it already, even though I only read it a few years ago. And then this year I read The Death of Mrs Westway, and I thought this one had so much potential. It had so many interesting ideas that could have been expanded on, but ultimately our main character was just stupid, and that was what the entire mystery thriller hinged on, which I just don't appreciate. It was sad and disappointing that so many of the interesting potential plot points were wasted, and it really solidified the idea for me that Ruth Ware is not an author for me, and I won't be reading any more of her work. The last two, I could be convinced to read more of their work under certain circumstances. This first one less so, and that is going to be a controversial one, and that is Stephen King. So I've read one book by Stephen King in my entire life. I read Salem's Lot, and I really enjoyed it. I remember really liking it. I know it shocks some people. Some people have called me out on it because it's such a long book, and nowadays it's well known that I don't like long books, but back in the day I was more interested in reading long books, and I read Salem's Lot. I did really enjoy it. I love a vampire story. I think this is a good one. I've thought about revisiting this one even, and I would do that. I would reread the one book that I've read by Stephen King, but I will not be reading any more Stephen King. I think that he's probably a fine author in many respects, and I think he's a growing, changing author, which is really interesting, and so many people love his work, but I can't think of any book that I would want to read by him and that I would get much out of, that I haven't seen in a movie adaptation, or that I haven't known the premise of for years and years. I didn't love his writing in Salem's Lot enough to just go on that. So I maybe possibly one day could be convinced to read more Stephen King, but I doubt it. The last author is Haruki Murakami. I read my first and only Haruki Murakami earlier this year. My friend Kai lent me South of the Border, West of the Sun, and I did enjoy it, but I also saw all the flaws that people talk about in Murakami's work. Although I liked that particular book, I didn't like it enough to propel me to read more of his work. This one I could be convinced. I don't think I would read the big staples, and I definitely wouldn't be reading his much longer work, but I could potentially see myself reading a different Murakami book. So let me know if you have any authors that you've read from that you enjoyed or you didn't enjoy, that you would never read from again. I could see there being a avenue where I really love a book, and that's why I don't read anymore from that author, because I don't want any of my love for that author to become tainted. But mostly I think I just stop reading authors that don't jive with me or that I don't like their writing style. Let me know if the same is true for you. Let me know if there's any authors that you've read a few books from and stopped reading completely. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!